Federal law allows some male inmates who identify as women to transfer to female prisons. As we approach the 2024 election, interest in this issue is growing. Keep Prisons Single Sex is a group at the forefront of this debate. Its mission is to protect the rights of women in prison. Amanda Sullman, USA Director of Keep Prisons Single Sex, welcome to VOZ.
Thank you very much. Thank you for highlighting the issue.
Before getting into it, could you please share with us your personal journey, how you got interested and involved in Keep Prisons Single Sex, in keeping prisons single sex?
So I was seeing the spread of gender identity enter into law and policy in the United States and found it concerning, and was tracking the issue in various states and at the federal government level, and realized that there was a real gap in terms of advocacy groups focusing on the issue of women in prison, who were among the very first to be subjected to gender identity having been enshrined in law and having that impact their housing situations, searches, tracking of data in the criminal justice system. And so I ended up becoming involved with Keep Prisons Single Sex, which was originally established in the UK in 2020, and shortly thereafter we opened up the USA branch.
Right. Now you're working in the US, UK, Canada, and Australia, right?
My work in particular is focused on the USA. The UK
Right.
branch of Keep Prisons Single Sex has actually shut down for the moment. So right now we are most active in the United States.
A Freedom of Information request, FOIA, made by your organization revealed that almost 50% of these female identifying inmates are there for sex offenses. What does this number tell us, Amanda, and could you help us understand the magnitude of this issue?
So this number is most significant when compared to the general prison population, which includes both men and women. So compared to that 48%, the entire general prison population is just about 12 to 13% conviction rates for sex offenses. So that is 4 times the rate, which if you were to exclude women from that number, it would definitely be even a lower general number that you'd be comparing it against. So that 4 times the rate is not just evidenced in the federal government data. That is reflected in other state data that has been obtained, or similar numbers, whether it's 4 times or 3 times, it's that general neighborhood. So that's true for California. The California conviction for sex offense rates is in the high 30%, compared to, as best estimates in California, a 16% sex offense rate amongst the general male prison population. The Heritage Foundation did a FOIA request on Wisconsin and found a similar number of 50%. Data from the UK shows similar numbers. Data from Canada shows similar numbers. So this is a consistency across multiple jurisdictions. And what it shows is it highlights that the men who are seeking to be moved into women's prison don't even have a criminal history that is the equivalent of your average male inmate when compared to your average female inmate, who tends to not be in for violence or sex offenses. Their offenses tend to be not just sex offenses, but magnitudes more in terms of violent offenses. So, for example, in addition to the data that you cited in the federal government, in terms of sex offenses, there's also data that they produce about levels of security. And security level classification is determined by a history of criminality, the violence of the crime, the likelihood of recidivism. And there too, the men identifying as women in federal prison are 3 times the rate at a high security level compared to the general prison population. And there are virtually no women, trans women who identify as men, because that's what we have numbers for. There are virtually none of those women are at a high security level. So when
Mm.
you take all of those together, it won't simply be, for example, sex offenses on paper, something like opening up a porn distribution site. Um, there's demonstrably that they are in for more violent offenses, more extensive criminality, higher rates of expected rates of recidivism, et cetera.
Right, right. You've you've kind of showed this already, but this is a complex issue. Um, the federal government, state governments, and local governments all have a say on how the prison system works. Could you break down this for us?
Sure. And one of the I'm I'm glad this is being highlighted because people often seek definitive data, and that there are so many systems is what makes it near impossible to find across the board. Uh, I would say definitive data, but really data at all. So
Mm.
for example, there is the federal system, which only governs federal crimes. And relative to the other criminal justice systems, it has a relatively small population. It is under 200,000 prison population there. So that is one system. Because they are under the federal public records request, they're actually quite good about turning over data, and we can track information there.
Right, because
At
they are
this,
kind of forced to, right? By
they're right, they're
organization like
forced to.
yours. Yeah.
There's a very strict law for them. They have deadlines, they're required to respond, and they do. Sometimes it takes a long time, but eventually they do. In the state systems, so there's one for every state, that has the largest cohort, and that's over 1 million people are in the across all the state systems. Each one of those will have their own state laws and or their own state policies, some of which maybe aren't even very easy to find. A policy is something that would be developed by the state correctional department as opposed to a state legislative body. So it isn't necessarily published. We don't necessarily know when they're being contemplated or produced or issued. You have to really dig around for them. Some of them are only obtainable via FOIA requests directly to the state. And in terms of obtaining data at the state level, my organization has in past years partnered with another organization called WDI USA, and we have done FOIA surveys, and there are at least 10 states who just don't respond at all.
So
There are
no
another
answer,
10, no answer at all.
zero.
Um,
Okay.
There are another 10 or so states who will say
Sorry,
something along the lines of, we don't.
would you say these states lean more Democratic or Republican? Can we say that?
We can't actually. It really is a mix, and it
Wow,
also
that's wow. Yeah.
yeah, it's it I was expecting that too, that there would be some consistency in terms of either geography or party governance, but that is not the case. So, for example, in the last round of surveys, which was done by WDI USA, Tennessee wouldn't answer, Texas wouldn't answer, Oklahoma wouldn't answer, Georgia wouldn't answer. So it isn't necessarily who the party in charge that is dictating this.
Okay.
And the states that won't provide data, some of them, for example, Illinois, Maine, Minnesota, we know that there are men in women's prisons in those states, and they won't provide data. So the state numbers are very difficult. However, compared to the jail system, the state numbers are easy. The jail systems, which are run either at the county level or the city municipal level, those have just about 3/4 of a million population at any given time. There are over 2,800 different systems of jail populations because every city, every county can have their own. And it is a very transitory population because those are individuals held there are generally either awaiting trial or they have been convicted with a sentence of less than 1 year. So there's very high turnover in that population, and that's just absolutely impossible to track.
Okay. Those who broadly defend this idea of transfers based on gender identification claim it helps to reduce sexual abuse, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but the current federal law is even named Prison Rape Elimination Act. What would you answer?
The Prison Rape Elimination Act itself is absolutely silent on sexual orientation or gender identity. That was developed at the regulatory level almost 10 years after the act itself had passed. And the regulation provides a way to do a risk assessment and a risk of abuse assessment for inmates. It very explicitly does not take into account the impact on others. It's a very myopic regulation. You are looking at an individual
Okay.
person who says, I want this or I feel this. And part of the analysis is not how does that impact other individuals who may have to live with a result of a decision. So my response to that would be the regulations ignore who will mostly be women who will be impacted by this, and further that the regulations have a suggestion in them that there are no other vulnerable groups of inmates. For example, there are inmates who are elderly, who are mentally disabled, who are handicapped. Those inmates are also vulnerable
Right.
in a men's prison. And so it sets up this special class of individuals and carves them out and provides privileges for them, literal privileges in terms of how they get to move in a prison system, showers, housing, etc., that is not afforded to any other group of inmates.
One possible solution that's been floating around for some years now is to have separate wings or pods for LGBT inmates. What do you think about this?
To a certain extent, it doesn't matter what I think about this because the regulation that's in effect right now does not allow that except for extremely limited circumstances. And it has to be in connection with
Right. That's
a
the
judgment
federal
decree.
regulation, right?
Correct. Yes, that is the PREA regulation or the PREA standards as they're also known. And that was added during the public review period of the regulations, because regulations do go out for public review. And my organization did not exist then. And a lot of organizations that have come up in the last several years who are focused on this issue of enshrining gender identity into law and policy didn't exist then. So the sole advocates who were providing input on that were trans activists. So they included that in a way that, as a companion, almost forces the other provisions of the regulations, which is, okay, well, you can't protect people this way. Now here's your only other way to do so. And it is worth mentioning that there had been sort of de facto such units, medical units in the California system, for example. There was a medical
Yeah.
unit that largely housed trans identifying inmates. And some of them were fine with that and weren't seeking to be moved to a women's prison.
Right. Um, let's address the elephant and the donkey in the room. With a few weeks to go before the general election, What do you expect from a Harris or a Trump administration regarding this issue?
So, first of all, for anyone who's participating in the elections in the US, I would encourage everyone to force the candidates who are in their districts to answer for this in terms of what their position is. Candidate Harris has had a record, even prior to being the vice president, had a record of seeking to enshrine gender identity in law and policy, and in fact bragged about doing so in the California prison system as the Attorney General there. On the Biden-Harris first day in office, they issued an executive order which enshrined gender identity throughout the federal system and required every federal agency to look at their rules and guidance. And if they did not already reflect gender identity wherever sex was discussed, that they were to remedy that and either reissue rules, reissue guidance, put out new regulations, which most of them did. So I would anticipate, although candidate Harris has at the moment not endorsed her own prior position on this as Attorney General, it seems more likely than not that these policies will either continue or be accelerated, depending on who's in office.
Okay, right. Now, shortly, because we're running out of time, what's next? What's the next step for Keep Prison Single Sex USA?
So we will continue to obtain data, which is one of our main missions. We will continue to provide consultation submissions, whether that's orally or in writing, when new policies or laws are being developed, or when there are nominated judges, for example, who have come down on this issue in terms of being frankly anti-woman and placing violent men in women's prisons, as happened this summer with one particular federal district court judge nominee. We will also continue to put out information that's easily digestible for the public, to be their own advocates for this in their cities and their states, because a lot of this happens at the city level or in larger cities or at the state level. And everyone needs to be an advocate to ensure that lies aren't enshrined in law, which then have trickle effects for all of us.
Amanda Sulman, USA Director of Keep Prison Single Sex, thank you for being here today with us at BOSS.
Thank you very much.